And we're going to start with we're going to start with a reading from Tom with The Other.
The other. The forest ended. Glad I was to feel the light and hear the hum of bees, smell the drying grass and the sweet mint, because I had come to an end of forest, and because here was both road and inn, the sum of what's not forest. But 'twas here they asked me if I did not pass yesterday this way. Not you? Queer. Who then? And slept here? I felt fear. I learnt his road, and ere they were sure I, left the dark wood behind. Kestrel and woodpecker, the inn and the sun, the happy mood when first I tasted sunlight there. I travelled fast in hopes I should outrun that other. What to do when caught I planned not. I pursued to prove the likeness, and if true, to watch until myself I knew. I tried the inns that evening of a long gabled high street grey of courts and outskirts, travelling an eager but a weary way in vain. It was not there. Nothing told me that ever till that day had one like me entered those doors, save once. That time I dared, you may recall, but never foamless shores make better friends than those dull bores, many and many a day like this, aimed at the unseen, moving goal, and nothing found but remedies for all desire. These made not whole, they sowed a new desire, to kiss desire's self, beyond control, desire of desire. And yet life stayed on within my soul. One night, in sheltering from the wet, I quite forgot I could forget. A customer and the landlady stared at me with a kind of smile. They hesitated awkwardly. Their silence gave me time for guile. Has anyone called there like me? I asked. It was quite plain the while succeeded, for they poured out all, and that was naught. Less than a mile beyond the inn I could recall he was like me in general. He had pleased them, but I less. I was more eager than before to find him out and to confess, to bore him and to let him bore. I could not wait. Children might guess I had a purpose, something more that made an answer indiscreet. One girl's caution made me sore, too indignant even to greet that other, had we chanced to meet. I sought then in solitude. The wind had fallen with the night, as still the roads lay, as the ploughland rude, dark and naked on the hill. Had there been ever any feud twixt earth and sky, a mighty will closed it. The crocketed dark trees, a dark house, dark, impossible cloud towers. One star, one lamp, one peace, held on an everlasting lease. And all was earth's, or all was skies. No difference endured between the two. A dog barked on a hidden rise. A marsh bird whistled high unseen. The latest waking blackbird's cries perished upon the silence keen. The last light filled a narrow firth among the clouds. I stood serene, with a solemn, quiet mirth, an old inhabitant of earth. Once the name I gave to hours like this was melancholy, when it was not happiness. And powers coming like exiles home again, and weakness quitting their bones, smiled and enjoyed, far off from men, moments of everlastingness. Fortunate my search was then, while what I sought, nevertheless, that I was seeking, I did not guess. That time was brief. Once more at inn and upon road I sought my man, till once, amid a tap room's din, loudly he asked for me, began to speak as if it had been a sin of how I thought and dreamed and ran after him thus day after day. He lived as one under a ban for this. What had I got to say? I said nothing. I slipped away. Now I dare not follow after too close. I try to keep in sight, dreading his frown and worse, his laughter. I steal out of the wood to light. I see the swift shoot from the rafter by the inn door. Ere I alight, I wait and hear the starlings wheeze and nibble like ducks. I wait his flight. He goes. I follow. No release until he ceases. Then I also shall cease.
Directive. Back out of all this now too much for us. Back in a time made simple by the loss of detail, burned, dissolved, and broken off like graveyard marble sculpture in the West. There is a house that is no more a house, upon a farm that is no more a farm, and in a town that is no more a town. The road there, if you let a guide direct you who only has at heart you're getting lost, may seem as if it should have been a quarry. Great monolithic knees the former town long since gave up pretense of keeping covered. And there's a story in a book about it. Besides the wear of iron wagon wheels, the ledgers show lines ruled southeast, northwest. The chisel work of an enormous glacier that braced his feet against the Arctic pole. You must not mind a certain coolness from him, still said to haunt this side of Panther Mountain. Nor need you mind the serial ordeal of being watched from 40 cellar holes, as if by eye pairs out of 40 firkins. As for the woods' excitement over you, that sends light rustle rushes to their leaves, charge that to upstart inexperience. Where were they all not 20 years ago? They think too much of having shaded out a few old pecker-fretted apple trees. Make yourself up a cheering song of how someone's road home from work this once was, who may be just ahead of you on foot, or creaking with a buggy load of grain. The height of the adventure is the height of country where two village cultures faded into each other. Both of them are lost. And if you're lost enough to find yourself by now, pull in your ladder road behind you and put up a sign, closed to all but me. Then make yourself at home. The only field now left's no bigger than a harness gall. First, there's the children's house of make-believe, some shattered dishes underneath a pine, the playthings in the playhouse of the children. Weep for what little things could make them glad. Then for the house that is no more a house, but only a belilacked cellar hole, now slowly closing like a dent in dough. This was no playhouse, but a house in earnest. Your destination and your destiny is a brook that was the water of the house, cold as a spring, as yet so near its source, too lofty and original to rage. We know the valley streams that when aroused will leave their tatters hung on barb and thorn. I had kept hidden in the instep arch of an old cedar at the waterside a broken drinking goblet like the Grail under a spell, so the wrong ones can't find it, so can't get saved, as St. Mark says they mustn't. I stole the goblet from the children's playhouse. Here are your waters and your watering place. Drink and be whole again beyond confusion.
Early one morning in May I set out. Nobody I knew was about. I'm bound away forever, away somewhere, away forever. There was no wind to trouble the weathercocks. I burnt my letters and burned and darned my socks. I'm bound away forever, away somewhere, away forever. No one knew I was going away. I thought myself I should come back someday. I'm bound away forever, away somewhere, away forever. I heard the brook through the town gardens run. Oh, sweet was the mud turned to dust by the sun. I'm bound away forever, away somewhere, away forever. A gate banged in a fence and banged in my head. A fine morning, sir, the shepherd said. I'm bound away forever, away somewhere, away forever. I could not return from my liberty to my youth and my love and my misery. I'm bound away forever, away somewhere, away forever. The past is the only dead thing that smells sweet, the only sweet thing that is not also fleet. I'm bound away forever, away somewhere, away forever.
Acquainted with the night. I have been one acquainted with the night. I have walked out in rain and back in rain. I have outwalked the furthest city light. I have looked down the saddest city lane. I have passed by the watchman on his beat and dropped my eyes, unwilling to explain. I have stood still and stopped the sound of feet when far away an interrupted cry came over houses from another street. But not to call me back or say goodbye. And further still, at an unearthly height, one luminary clock against the sky proclaimed the time was neither wrong nor right. I have been one acquainted with the night.
I never saw that land before, and now can never see it again, yet as if by acquaintance hoar, endeared, by gladness and by pain, great was the affection that I bore to the valley and the river small, the cattle, the grass, the bare ash trees, the chickens from the farmsteads, all elm hidden, and the tributaries descending at equal interval. The blackthorns down along the brook with wounds yellow as crocuses, where yesterday the labourer's hook had sliced them cleanly, and the breeze that hinted all and nothing spoke. I neither expected anything nor yet remembered, but some goal I touched then, and if I could sing, what would not even whisper my soul as I went on my journeying, I should use as the trees and birds did, a language not to be betrayed, and what was hid should still be hid, excepting from those like me made, who answer when such whispers bid.
piece, the portrait, isn't it?
The Quest of the Purple Fringed. I felt the chill of the meadow underfoot, but the sun o'erhead. And snatches of verse and song of scenes like this I sung or said. I skirted the margin alders for miles and miles in a sweeping line. The day was the day by every flower that blooms, but I saw no sign. Yet further I went to be before the scythe, for the grass was high, till I saw the path where the slender fox had come and gone panting by. Then at last, and following him, I found, in the very hour when the colour flushed to the petals, it must have been the far-sought flower. There stood the purple spires, with no breath of air, nor headlong bee to disturb their perfect poise the livelong day neath the alder tree. I only knelt, and putting the boughs aside, looked, or at most counted them all to the buds in the copse's death that were pale as a ghost. Then I arose and silently wandered home, and I, for one, said that the fall might come and whirl of leaves, for summer was done.
Rain. Midnight rain. Nothing but the wild rain on this bleak hut and solitude and me. Remembering again that I shall die. Neither hear the rain, nor give it thanks for washing me cleaner than I have been since I was born into this solitude. Blessed are the dead that the rain rains upon. But here I pray that none whom once I loved is dying tonight, or lying still awake, solitary, listening to the rain, either in pain or thus in sympathy, helpless among the living and the dead, like a cold water among broken reeds, myriads of broken reeds, all still and stiff, like me, who have no love which this wild rain has not dissolved, except the love of death, if love it be for what is perfect and cannot, the tempest tells me, disappoint.
Desert places. Snow falling, and night falling fast, oh fast, in a field I looked into, going past. And the ground almost covered smooth in snow, but a few weeds and stubble showing last. The woods around it have it, it is theirs. All animals are smothered in their lairs. I am too absent-spirited to count. The loneliness includes me unawares. And lonely as it is, that loneliness will be more lonely ere it will be less. A blanker whiteness of benighted snow with no expression, nothing to express. They cannot scare me with their empty spaces between stars on stars where no human race is. I have it in me so much nearer home to scare myself with my own desert places.
It's great stuff.
Lovely readings again, Tom. Gordon. Thank you very much.
I must say it's a very, very strange feeling recording in this sort of strange ambience. Not quite exactly as I sort of envisage it, but it's, yes, thank you very much.
Should say too, we're in a courthouse.
I know.
Those people don't realise, so we're up in court. That's where we're doing the recording.
Yes, I suppose he sits up there, the magistrate.
Yes. Yeah. Yes. Part of our brave new world. Edna, would you like to lead off on this section as we start?
Well, I suppose when Bob and I were thinking about the programme, we considered whether there might be a movement from more physical paths and walks to more metaphysical ones. But I think, as we've already seen, you can't actually make that separation at all in either Frost or Thomas. But in starting the second session with the other and directive, I suppose we had in mind that there are poems by both poets which from the beginning represent themselves as parable, perhaps, as immediately symbolic, as journeys or quests or pilgrimages, whether into the self, into the past, into memory, into poetry, perhaps, into the origins and sources of poetry. And actually, I was hearing those marvelous readings, and I thought all the readings have been terrific. One little parallel between directive and the other struck me. The word whole, these made not whole in the other, and drink can be whole again beyond confusion. I know the end of directive has been subject to a lot of argument as to the positive or negative or ambiguous meanings of that injunction. But it does seem to me that both in their parabolic mode and in that sense of some, again, multi-level journey, that the hearing those two poems read together brings out the metaphysical and sort of psychological affinity between the poetry of Frost and Thomas, and some of the other poems that have just been read, Acquainted with the Night, Rain, Desert Places. They also invite that kind of comparison, perhaps.
I was just working on that poem for some time, and it seems very truthful to start with. It's like their usual walks together, and then it turns into M.R. James or something, and I just can't really believe that suddenly did anybody ever turn on him and say, "You are a stalker, get out of my life." I'm just fascinated. If it doesn't seem to have, I'm not sure it's real at the end. It's been pushed into fiction. It's turned into a short story, but is there any basis for saying somebody really did take umbrage?
Well, was that a person? That's what I can't decide after reading and listening to it. Was he chasing like a ghost, a vision, or I mean, you would think not, because the other people said they saw him. But yeah, I will have to read that some more.
Well, there are different versions of doubles in Edward Thomas's work. There is a man called the Other Man in his book In Pursuit of Spring, who is a version of Thomas, really. It's a chance, really, for Thomas to laugh at himself by having this man who's also kind of guidebook writer, if you like, who's obsessed with weathercocks. And Thomas kind of, in a way, is laughing at the concept of writing for a living and having to scribble down everything you can think of, every little town you visit. But it's very far from that to then get to the other, which, as we've heard, is a lot more kind of metaphysical and ghostly than the Other Man in Pursuit of Spring.
And the thing that was started off the very beginning of the evening was a guy reading about Harry Hood and saying, "I've not walked with anybody else as much as myself. I mean, I've walked with you more times than I've walked with myself, or than with anyone else, including myself." So he suddenly, it's just as much more. It's not just a sort of trope. It's sort of rather witty observation or something.
Yeah. I mean, and later in the Icknield Way, there's the famous passage about rain, which is strongly connected to the poem Rain, which we heard, where he's actually in bed with himself, because he talks about being in bed and hearing a ghostly presence talking to him. And it's unclear what Thomas is saying and what this ghostly presence is saying. And Thomas also, as we know, took on a different name in order to be a poet. He becomes Edward Eastaway. He thought at one point about, when he wrote his novel, The Happy-Go-Lucky Morgans, which is a kind of fictional autobiography, that it would be published under another name, Arthur Foxfield. So he's always been inclined towards extra identities and doubleness. But the other is unlikely, probably, I don't know what Edna thinks or Ralph, it's unlikely to be based on any one specific incident or a real person.
Yes, no, I think it's purely in the realm of parable, a parable of the divided self, and just another way in which Thomas invokes the double. When he became a soldier, and in that poem Home, he seems to himself as another man. But also in one of his letters earlier, he's talking about the other tenant in his head, so that it definitely derives from his experience of mental illness, however we specify that sense of there being two people in his head, or alienation from himself. And I think the other is an extraordinary psychodrama for its historical moment. Remember, Thomas had undergone psychoanalysis with Godwin Baines, and Freud is only just coming into view at this point, and I think he anticipates some, or shares some Freudian and also Jungian notions in the other. I think this is a very extraordinary and disturbing poem, and he may also take the snippets of conversations he's had on his various walks and journeys, but he puts them into a context which is utterly different and has no reality or literal reality in the other.
Did Bob post, I'm sorry, Ralph, did Bob post a recording of Gordon reading a story or a letter where he meets his doppelganger in the street? And it's a very, very physical, he tells it as if it's an absolute true happening. Did we see that? Or have I dreamt it?
I have it right here in front of me if you want me to read it.
He did read it, and I think I did send it. So,
okay.
But go ahead, Don.
Do we have his recording? I'm sure it's better than what I can put together.
But it was really creepy.
Yes.
If you leave it with me, I will see whether I can get hold of a copy and share it with everyone. So I will have a quick look at what's there.
I was glad to hear the word double enter the conversation, because to me, often in Thomas, we find ourselves in the terrain of the uncanny. And interestingly enough, Otto Rank was publishing his work on doubles and doubling at approximately the same time that Thomas is writing these poems. What's interesting is that you can read Thomas's poems both from a kind of literary symbolic use of doubling, which has a long literary history. But also, if you go back and read Rank's essay on doubling, it also fits with what he describes as the neurotic response to or need for this process of creating a kind of alter ego. What's interesting to me in the Thomas poem is that when the two ultimately meet, he is overwhelmed and drowned out by the alter ego, who seems to have been much more successful in every regard than the speaker of the poem. He seems to have been better liked. He seems to have had more success with women. He seems to be more assertive. He seems to have his own sense of direction, while the other, the speaker of the poem, is cast in a kind of role of dependence.
But he completely switches. He switches from being the strong narrative to this ghost in the wood, and he sort of creeps out of the wood, and he's become a wraith.
Where in Frost's encounter, if we get to hear Gordon read it, in Frost's encounter, his response is, "I think I will absorb this other and become stronger," which is entirely different from Thomas's sense of the relation between his identity and his alter identity. So I think for Thomas, the poems are both a kind of conscious literary working out of the double motif, and also a kind of psychological self-exploration that comes to no positive resolution. I mean, he finally does seek and find an alter ego in the role of the soldier, but we know where that leads him. The pursuit of death finally discovers it. I find these poems to be terribly moving and deeply disturbing. The other is enough to give you nightmares if you read it too closely too often.
Yet he has that transcendent moment right in the middle of it. It's that wonderful. I mean, it's so beautiful.
But the death of desire is the fulfillment of all desires. I mean,
yes. What does that mean?
Yeah.
John, what does that mean? Because he says, I lived on within my soul. So it's almost, I mean, the remedies for all desire are sort of drink or just masculine things, but to kiss desire's self beyond control and then desire of desire, which might be, it is the desire of desire's death or something. It has got this thanatos element in it. But it's very strange, and I just don't know what he was meaning until he says, and yet life stayed on within my soul. And then one evening, sheltering from the wet, I learned I could forget, not, I
forgot I could forget.
Yes, I could forget. I could wipe it out and get rid of it all. So,
he forgot he could forget.
Yeah.
Right. Well, one thing that puzzled me when I got to the end of the first stanza, just those 3 words, I felt fear. And I thought it was strange. Just like, perhaps if someone said, hey, there was someone who looked like you here yesterday, I'd say, oh, that's cool, but why the fear, and perhaps this the loneliness of a single traveler sleeping out. But that's what seemed odd to me, rather than being kind of fascinated in a fun way. It was instant fear.
The other thing that's strange about that first stanza is he's coming out of the dark wood.
Yes.
He's coming out into the light and the inn, which is all that the wood is not. And yet it's there that he finds that he has this experience, this uncanny experience of both being himself and not himself. I mean, the fear I perceived, I took the fear, the first mention of fear as, have I already done this and forgotten about it? Or was there some level of awareness to which I no longer have access?
Well, it's uncanny if somebody says, you slept in this inn last night, and you think, have I just had a brain fuse?
I mean, that's precisely the definition of the uncanny, yes? There's that perception of the familiar in the unfamiliar.
And I just mentioned to Guy, I had an inspiration this evening that because I was thinking of, I've come to the borders of sleep. That's strange, the forest image of that, which is a very positive, even if it's a deathly sort of image. But I said, oh, the forest ended. It's a depression. He's having a depression. And glad I was to feel out in the sunshine again. And yes, the forest ended. It's almost a sort of horror of death. And
so glad I was to be in the light. I've been here before.
Yes. Sweet Minton. Because I'd come to an end of forest, and because here was both road and in the sun, human companionship and hospitality and everything is all that's not forest. So forest is not conviviality. It's loneliness and questing.
I mean, the Ignored Ways is rather like this as a narrative, I think. I mean, there's another double figure that he meets in the Ignored Way just before the passage that Guy refers to, which is so famous about the rain, is that he meets, as he walks along, a man on Ivinghoe Beacon who is a kind of emblem of himself. And it is a kind of recollection by Thomas of his life in the house up on the hill above Steep, which he was kind of given by a friend. And this man is supremely melancholy, and that leads into the episode that evening where he hears the rain and is devastated by the rain. But then curiously and sort of very strikingly, in line with what you've just been saying, really, the next morning he wakes up and the sun is shining and the birds are singing, and he just sort of goes on. And it's as if where the forest ends and when you walk back onto the road, to go back to what we've been talking about earlier on, there's a possibility of escaping from that haunting double into the next step of life, into the movement forward. And I think it's also absolutely right, as Guy says, that the other man figures really importantly in Pursuit of Spring. But in a sense, the narrative of that book is one where finally, in the last chapters, the other man vanishes. The other man is got rid of. And spring arrives. And there's a kind of sense of uplift and rejoicing at the end of that text, because the other man is gone and the sun has come out and spring has arrived. So as well as there being a sense that of haunting by these uncanny figures, there are possibilities in these pilgrim narratives of Thomas kind of getting beyond that into a greater sense of personal wholeness. And personal wholeness is connected with transitoriness as well as sort of movement forward along the road. And you don't necessarily know where the road is leading or what its destination might be. In fact, in a sense, having no destination is as it were, the epitome of being on the road. And that you kind of escape from, as it were, the sense of needing to have an identity and needing to have a target and needing to have, as it were, to achieve success in the eyes of the world by carrying on along this road, along these steps of time. And as you do that, you leave behind the other man, I think, who the other man sort of figures for him all the things that's expected of you, all the things which are required of you to achieve in the eyes of the world worth and value. And if you can set that behind, if you can put that behind and just sort of walk along the road in step with time, then you leave behind the other man and you achieve a degree of wholeness, I think.
I think in what you get in a number of Thomas's poems is the unexpected epiphany. The journey or the quest doesn't necessarily get you to the goal you expect, but then something seems to happen. Or when you're expecting an epiphany, it doesn't happen, as at the end of the path. And I think in the middle of the other, which I do think begins maybe in the womb or in the unconscious, whatever the forest means, and complex of things in Thomas as in, or symbolizes a complex of things, or the complexity of things in Thomas as in Frost. But then in that middle stanza, where there is unexpected serenity, and the word one is repeated, there is wholeness there, and that's after the failures to achieve wholeness earlier, either in escapism or in some kind of drug or whatever that might mean. And I do associate the epiphany in the middle of the other, in the oneness, the wholeness that occurs at that point, but then doesn't last. You have to continue the search, the quest. It's something to do with poetry as well. There's a lot of quotations from various poets, like the everlastingness, for example, and romantic poets at that point. And I have a feeling that the wholeness achieved there has something to do, or implicitly to do, with poetry, with being able to write poems. But then that dissolves, and
so
I have to go
Edna,
on.
because you pinched it for your title of your eminent book about language not to be betrayed, and you just mentioned the goal, I was really fascinated this time, but some goal I touched then in this sort of transcendent sort of state, some goal I touched then, and if I could sing, almost like that folk song, if I could sing out loud, what would not even whisper my soul? What are the things your soul would never dare whisper? It's the ultimate blasphemy or something or other. There's almost something that, if I could sing what I've really seen about life or something or other, but I wouldn't even dare. My soul wouldn't even dare to say it. There's something very fascinating there.
I think that's actually rather positive. I mean, I think, again, there's some kind of discovery of poetry. It's the landscape of poetry. And perhaps whisper does allude to frost, to mowing. I mean, Thomas does use whisper of poetry or of his poetry and aspens as well. So there, that might be positive. There.
So that I would not even whisper, my soul would not dare whisper that I am a poet. I'm like Keats. I wouldn't dare say that.
I'm going to take the darker side here. I find something terribly troubling about a poem that reaches its epiphany, uncertain as it is, in the middle, and then continues by cycling back exactly where it started. It seems to me that Thomas, in this poem, finally meets the other and is overwhelmed by the other, and the other ceases to be a shadow of him and he becomes a shadow of the other. He lurks at the edges. It's only when the other ceases, he says, then I shall cease. The only thing Thomas suggests that may not disappoint, he can't be certain, but the only thing in life that may not disappoint is death. And it's only in death that these two come together. Only when he ceases will I cease. Until then, this troubling doubling, that's nice, that this troubling doubling will persist. Poem after poem. And to my mind, at this point in his life, Thomas goes in pursuit of death and ultimately finds it. He seeks that alter ego and carries that alter ego with him to the front. Poetry becomes a way of expressing, but it's no solution for Thomas, I don't think. It doesn't answer these questions. It just allows him to pose them more compellingly.
I was just going to say that, echoing you and what Ralph say. If Frost or if Thomas was ever able to escape that other into that kind of life of purpose and expectation, he was able to do it when he went to the front, because those two different others merged at the front. They became the same person, right? So as you are moving into expectation and heroism and sort of escaping the endless monologue in your head that's leading you toward darkness, the front then becomes the perfect place where that synthesis becomes possible.
He has actually given a double identity on the memorial to Thomas in London in Morden Cemetery, though, because it calls him poet soldier with the hyphen between the two. So there's always that sense of the double with Thomas of marrying soldier and poet. That same memorial in Morden Cemetery actually has his brother, and his brother died just after the war, and he calls him, and he's cited there as actor soldier, again hyphenated. So there's this possible other sense of double identity in Thomas as well, of course, of the man of action and the man of poetry. I was just going to mention another thing, going back to Don's point about taking the darker side. Thomas was also interested in the kind of Gothic fiction of the double and Jekyll and Hyde. I'm just going to mention a bit in Thomas's unpublished novel Fiction, which he wrote early in 1914, where he says, that I did not care about my work was, I thought, an advantage. It could not get hold of me and stifle me, for it would employ only my hands and a certain section of my knowledge. The rest of me would be free. After office hours, my escape would be absolute, and then the holidays would enable me, according to my powers and wishes, to live another life as different as that of Jekyll from that of Hyde. So I don't know how much you want to read into that, but there is that sense of doubleness going right from
I guess
teenage years with Thomas.
Well, we all have that. We all have our good and bad angel, don't we?
I guess William Wilson by Poe must also be behind it.
Mhm.
And it's what's his name? Merchant of Venice, Lancelot Gobbo.
Gobbo.
He has his good and his bad angel on each shoulder, don't they?
I mean, what Thomas is in a sense doing there is dividing up the sense of the working life and then the other life, which in a way he escapes from because he never has the office job, which might take us all the way back to what we were saying about with Frost throwing in the job in order to become poet in England, taking on different identities. And both of them are people who haven't had to juggle the office job and the poetic life. Thomas by choosing to become a writer, and Frost by having the trust fund, by the sounds of it, that allowed him to live as poet for a brief while.
It's what you were saying about Frost running away. I mean, this, I can't pin it to an actual song. It's not quite Shenandoah or Rio. Did anybody notice that? I mean, is anybody shocked that I put all the refrains into the song? Because
I was wondering about that.
That's quite right. Yeah.
Because, I mean, if it was in your hymnal, it puts the first refrain in, and it just does the first refrain and the last refrain, and you're meant to sing the refrain every time. And that poem, which I've rather ignored, is just absolutely wonderful. And the actual couplets become very, very charged. A gate banged in a fence and banged in my head. Fine morning, sir, Shepherd said. I'm bound away forever.
I think that was an excellent choice to put the refrain in each time. Yeah.
Because whoever suggested that, thank you very, very much, Bob or somebody. And because it tied up with the Frost thing of sort of going away. But it is also metaphysically, I mean, bound away forever, away somewhere, away forever. That's going to happen to us all. Sorry, yes, I've missed. Yes, it's in my head, but when I read my writing, it's burned my letters and darned my socks, which is lovely, little detail. Whose letters? Which letters? And there was no wind to trouble the weathercocks. And you've got to hear I don't know how to say it because it's got a very strong rhythm. I was hitting the rhythm because you have to do, yes. There was no wind to trouble the weathercocks and burn my socks and bound away forever. And there's one line which is a very extended line. You should cut out one of the two syllables. I thought myself I should come back someday, and I was just saying, could you shorten the should? I thought myself I'd come back someday. That didn't work either, but he's got an extra foot in there. No one knew I was going away. I thought myself I should come back someday. I'm bound away forever. Fascinating poem.
Frost writes a poem on using the same song, and I'm bound away. And if dissatisfied, I can't pull it into memory.
I thought that was one of the really interesting things about these choices, that the Bound Away poem is a poem which in a way alludes to Frost's delight in Shenandoah. And the other interesting thing I thought was that Directive and the other both have in the background Hardy's poems. Because Directive has got this big allusion in the middle to the poem by Hardy about losing the glass when he and his then wife Emma are so under the waterfall, is really strongly echoed by that poem Directive. And the other is one of those kind of narrative poems which really echoes very strongly by Sicily from Hardy's first collection. So there's a sense that that Frost and Thomas don't only connect as two writers walking around and sharing these walks, but they have in the background of their exchanges a very strong sort of sense of common ground in terms of the poems they love and the folk songs they love.
Yes, I think Hardy is very much shared source for them both, and I think that's insufficiently recognised. I think there's was it Sam Hines who wrote a good essay on Frost and Hardy, and you know, there's like we're talking about in a way the dark and melancholy aspect of Thomas's and also Frost's imagination, and you know, these are three of them very pessimistic poets. There's that post-Darwinian, you know, death of God metaphysic, which is common to all three of them, and again something which I think should be more widely recognised, and that they take different metaphysical tracks, although some of those paths coincide or interlace. But I think that's part of the you know, the problem that Frost and Thomas aren't so often looked at together, or Frost, Thomas and Hardy aren't looked at together. Whereas if we were to take those three poets and think about them, about the modern poetry at this in the early 20th century, we might get a rather different picture from some other narratives.
Just a couplet here, I mean, couplet from that song again. I must do the song, the Ash Grove and things like that, and Amsterdam,
yes.
Girls in Amsterdam, all the song ones with great fascination. But just, I mean, it just comes in as one of the couplets. I could not return from my liberty to my youth and my love and my misery. I mean, it's a brilliant couple of lines, that, which seems to be, could not return from my liberty to my youth and my love and my misery. It's just very, I mean, that's quintessential Edward Thomas, I think.
Return to his misery, right? You might want to return to your youth, but why would you want to return to your misery? Unless, you know, that's essentially part of being a young person, perhaps.
Well, you know, it's not necessarily Thomas who's speaking. I suppose we do see that, set that poem among the valedictory poems that become more frequent as, you know, the point of departure for France gets nearer, and he does draw on the early, you know, the early One Morning folk song as well. But it's extraordinary what he, as with the other, what he does with, in a way, a kind of folk narrative, a gothic story, because there's something surreal about early One Morning as well, which might look initially like a blithe, you know, setting out in May, you know, and not a care in the world, and then it becomes darker.
Probably not quite true. Don't people think dead leaves have a rather sweet smell, or is that sickly? The past is the only dead thing that smells sweet, the only sweet thing that is not also fleet.
I'd like to ask Frost people, you know, what they think about you know, Frost's psychology as compared with Thomas. You know, we do, of course, throw around, you know, terms like depression and so on. And the question of whether it's a matter of circumstance, you know, Frost suffered these tragedies in his life, or did he have a difficult psychological history before these events occurred? But it does seem to be that there's some recognition on that front as well between Frost and Thomas, and the sort of psychological imagery in the poems would seem to confirm that. Sorry to ask such a basic question, but
perfectly fine question. We heard in Acquainted with the Night that Frost knows the dark side. Mental illness of various kinds runs through Frost family, paranoid schizophrenia, depression, suicides. Frost is fully aware of the pull toward the dark and toward death. And very often in the poems, you find his resources for fighting back. I mean, look at Desert Places. If Thomas had written Desert Places, I suspect it might have ended with the line, with no expression, nothing to express. And Frost instead looks about him for some type of resource to fight the darkness, and comes up with the fact that, well, the outer world can't scare me because the inner world is capable of scaring me even more. Talk about a whistling past the graveyard response to the threat of depression and death. I mean, I just found the poem in which Frost makes his use of bound away. It's very short, so I'll just give it to you. And it answers as well this question about their psychological affinities and differences. It's also a walking poem. It's called Away. Now I out walking, the world desert, and my shoe and my stocking do me no hurt. I leave behind good friends in town. Let them get well wined and go lie down. Don't think I leave for the outer dark, like Adam and Eve put out of the park. Forget the myth. There is no one I am put out with or put out by. Unless I'm wrong, I but obey the urge of a song. I'm bound away. And I may return if dissatisfied with what I learned from having died. You can see in Frost always that need to turn back toward life, to turn back to the struggle. But I think that the pull of the darkness is powerful in Frost, and that he sensed it in Thomas.
I think in directive, I mean, you make yourself up a cheering song of how someone's rode home from work this once was. I mean, that's part of what I mean, this poem, it's all about almost unbearable loss, directive, it seems to me, and trying to find out what you can actually pull from the loss. What I find difficult to fathom in directive is the tone of voice, because it seems to me it's constantly shifting from a sort of playful tone, from a very portentous tone, even maybe an apocalyptic tone, but then there are echoes of nursery rhymes. There's even a suggestion almost of a cartoon being watched from 40 cellar holes, as if by eye pairs out of 40 firkins. I know that one critic has said that reminds him of a moment when, you know, in the darkness, suddenly a lot of eyes light up in the dark, as you see in a cartoon. And I don't know. I mean, it's I think it's a wonderful poem, and I'm always very happy to teach it, but I never quite know, when I do teach it, I never know how my lesson is going to end. I don't even know on what tone I'm going to end the lesson with, and it depends very much on how the students react, because there are just so many strange things going on in this poem. I mean, the broken drinking goblet like the Grail. There also seems to me that there are moments when he's getting a dig at T.S. Eliot.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so, you know, as I say, is it a poem? Well, it's a poem also about the need for play, for the a goblet that gets stolen from the children's playhouse. But it's also a poem in which you weep for what little things could make them glad. And then in the middle of the poem, you get that, you know, after he's given you that this extraordinary journey which you're going on, in which you're seeing these desperate attempts to get a living from the soil, all of them being wiped out, then suddenly he says, then make yourself at home. Followed by the only field now left's no bigger than a harness gall. And that's an extraordinary image of pain and suffering, in sort of every way. So as I said,
I think I think Frost mentions in a letter that directive should satisfy the Eliot crowd. So I think he really did have the wasteland in mind when he composed the poem. And getting back to what Edna's question, you know, in desert places, I can't help but also think of Wallace Stevens and that great phrase in Stevens, the violence from within will protect us from the violence from without, or must protect us from the violence without. And so I think for Frost, you know, the excesses of the imagination can be just as dangerous as the excesses of the assaults from the material world. And so that somehow you have to kind of find the resources to establish a stasis between those two potential assaults so that your mental resources can protect you by, you know, turning to a story of another kind, as he says, and the heart's beginning to cloud the mind, or, you know, finding a way to turn back and go to the woods as a way perhaps of escaping the own excesses of your imagination and darkness. But absolutely, I agree with Don that he's always trying to summon up the inner resources to protect himself from either the assaults of the physical world or the assaults of the excessive imagination. And when I look at the other, for example, I'm always seeing that other, that pursuit of the other as constantly there. And I'm glad that Ralph told us that in Pursuit of Spring, he seems to escape it, but it always seems to me that in Thomas, the escape is simply temporary. Whatever moments of happiness he sees or he finds the escape from the other, he's always drawn back into that dark world where Frost is constantly channeling the resources to protect himself against those darker impulses.
The most interesting doubling in Frost is actually in that little play he wrote called A Way Out, where the two characters are nearly identical, and one is a backwoodsman with the name as a Goral, so he's living as a gorilla or in a beastly life, and then the stranger who comes to hide away in his cabin and wants to assume his identity. And the play ends in a kind of murder off stage. So we're left uncertain which of the two characters has survived. It's Frost's really sort of only extended foray into the Gothic. And I think Thomas would have found something appealing in it. Although Frost always, when asked about the play, would say that although he would have said which survived if he wanted to tell us, he always indicates that it was the stranger who does survive. So he couldn't leave the mystery unresolved. But it is the only time in Frost really where the confrontation between self and other is resolved in violence, in the murder of one by the other, as though only one can survive. So that I think, in a sense, Frost doesn't have Thomas's sense that there is always this other self whose need must be satisfied. I don't know if that Frost had a necessarily more integrated personality so much as he had a far greater force of will. If I had to characterize Frost with one word, I would say that all of his poetry is an act of the will in subjugating the world and meeting its threats. And that, I think, might be what I see as the difference between them.
Do you think that makes his poetry less subtle than Thomas, because he resorts maybe to a declaration of some kind or a conclusion, whereas Thomas gives us the psychodrama? That can be, I mean, there's a lot in common between desert places and rain. You know, technically, you know, the repetitions, you know, they're both, you know, interior dramas of a dark kind. But I wonder whether Frost had even got rain in mind when he wrote Desert Places, or somewhere in his unconscious. But I just wanted to, we were talking about their melancholia or their darkness. So there's a moment in the Frost-Thomas letters where there's almost a competition as to which of them can be the darker or the most melancholy. Because Frost, I think, says something to Thomas like, he was almost pleased, cheered to get a depressed letter from Thomas, because he thought Thomas had got well-minded through having got into things, having got into the war, whereas he, Frost, was now in a bad place because he hadn't got into things. But then Thomas writes him a really depressed letter, and he's happy, Frost is happy again. So there's that kind of mutual awareness between them of their desert places and their midnight rain. Yeah.
And Frost would spend a lifetime trying to talk those close to him out of depression. His wife, his son, his daughter, his sister, his mother. I mean, he spent a lifetime trying to use the force of his own will to slow, my companion there, to slow the descent of others.
The embodiment of the force of the will just appeared and assaulted you there.
Black dog of my consciousness, yes.
Yes, man and dog.
Well, I would say actually.
How should you know? No.
Oh, I'm sorry. I was just going to think something, a phrase that Edna used about well-mindedness and the will, right? So that just reminds me so much of William James, and the will to believe, and this whole, in the varieties of, religious experience. And he talks about the healthy-minded individuals, and then the ones who aren't the healthy-minded. And I think that may have framed a little of his perspective about mental illness and getting through it, and kind of willing yourself through things.
I just
The
thinking
figure of the will braving alien entanglement.
No,
Do you think that's getting on a good place to stop this? Because
I have one question that and I may want to direct this toward Ralph. When we were talking about choices earlier, I was thinking about Frost's turn back to the lyric poem in Mountain Interval. And I'm wondering if you have any insights perhaps on how Frost began to refashion his career or the trajectory of his career after reading Thomas's lyrics. I mean, I'm just curious about what you all think about that sort of, maybe as a summary.
I think that's a great question, Bob, and I think it's
Man and dog.
Yeah, and I think the dog should answer it. I think that Mountain Interval is such a fascinating collection, isn't it? And the collocation in it of these intense lyrical poems, and then poems like Snow and A Bonfire, which are kind of exaggerations of some of the things that he seeks to achieve in North of Boston. Exaggerations in the sense that Snow is so enormous. And I think that Snow is another poem about roads and the blockage of the possibility of movement and the struggle to move forward, so that the sense that will is both essential and in some way sort of socially unacceptable. It'd be much more sensible for him to stay overnight, but instead of doing that, he plows on through the snow to his home. I think that's a very Thomas-like poem, and I think what I was saying about Road Not Taken, this isn't quite the question you're asking, I think, Bob, but the sense in Road Not Taken I have is that Frost is thinking about his own decision not to take part in the war, his own kind of, the way the pressures on him to go back to America were so strong that he couldn't enact the heroic vision that he had for himself. It seems to me that Bonfire and Snow are both addressed to an American public in the context of how long will America stay neutral in 16, and also addressed to himself into and sort of reflecting on not just Thomas's lyricism, but Thomas's ultimate capacity to choose to take part in the war, to enlist and to go forward and to plough on into the snow, if you like. And despite the objections of his family, despite the objections of good common sense. So the protagonist of the snow is in some ways rather similar to Thomas. So I think the relations between Mountain Interval and Frost's response to Thomas are partly generic. You know, how do I start rewriting lyric poems in the light of what Thomas has done? But also a kind of continuing reflection on Frost's part of what his friend has achieved and what his friend has decided to do in the face of common sense, in the face of what his family wanted. And yeah, so I think what you're hinting at there, Bob, is really astute. That the Mountain Interval is very much, I think, a response to Thomas, and that hasn't been fully noted in Frost, and the ways in which that collection responds to Thomas, you know, are quite complex.
I think it's also important to look at what Thomas is doing from the start in his response to Frost. When we say he learned from Frost, and Up in the Wind is perhaps his nearest to a Frost eclogue, though it isn't as long as, even so long as they generally are. And it's interesting to pick out through Thomas's poems the few which are narrative dialogue poems. And there's a point where Frost is urging Thomas to do something more like an eclogue, you know, to introduce characters. And he liked the beginning of Lob best because he had the people coming in and giving the tones of voice, as Frost said. So Thomas then promises Frost he'll try, but he doesn't try very hard. And the nearest he comes up with is that poem Home, about walking with other soldiers. And there is conversation, but it's not a very long poem either. So Thomas really goes for the lyric almost instantaneously. And I think he also produces in a more concentrated version of the Frost eclogue when he has conversation poems. And I think As the Team's Head Brass is an extraordinary, if you like, transformation of the Frost eclogue into a war poem, a very English war poem. So he obviously does take that element from Frost, but it really is lyric at the core from the beginning. And I think I agree with Bob that Frost may have then thought he maybe could learn something from Thomas. And I'm glad he did that. West Running Brook is a more lyrical collection.
And I think I'd also talk about Sound of Trees at the end of Mountain Interval as a kind of very Thomas influenced Frostian lyric.
Yes.
And it's very close to Aspens, and it's very close to Lights Out, I think. So he's absolutely responding to those Thomas.
He is in dialogue with Thomas there, absolutely.
Definitely.
And I think it's very good to know that A Mountain Interval arrived in time for Thomas to take it to France with him. So he did have it.
Yeah, that's a very touching thought, isn't it? That he's in the trenches in Arras in 17 with the opportunity to read these poems, and would surely have recognised that it was different from north of Boston, and some of its differences from north of Boston brought it closer to him. Whether he felt that was his influence or it was a kind of sense that the two of them were coming together in that connection, who knows? But no, it's very powerful, and it's also clear that he knew that Frost had seen his poems as well.
Yeah,
important.
Very good.
It's a great question, Bob.
Yeah, thank you.
Yes.
Sorry, Jeremy, just jumping in there with people asking questions. We have had a couple come in over the chat if people are happy for me to put them over.
Do.
So Robert has asked, Frost is often given the credit of teaching Thomas to write poetry. Do you believe if Thomas and Frost had not met and not walked in Dimmock, they would not have been such good poets?
Who's going to lead on that one?
Yes, I do believe that. I do believe that, but I think that myself that Thomas is sort of catalyzed into writing poetry by Frost, but his poetry isn't, as Edna's saying, it's kind of influenced by Frost, but it's not imitative of Frost. I mean, he is his own poet from the beginning, thanks to Frost encouraging him to feel that he could be a poet. So that the idea that Frost taught Thomas is not something I'd necessarily agree with. I mean, I think he was already an incredibly gifted writer and kind of writing intuitively towards his poetry, and Frost was more an enabler and a kind of affirmer of Thomas's gift rather than the person who taught him how to be.
A midwife, if you will.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
I'm not sure I like the imagery, but
no.
And we had another question that's come through from Jeremy, not Mitchell. What is the likely source of the sense of loss in Thomas's poems? Is it the imminent threat of war or something else in his character?
You've got some thoughts there, Tom.
Well, I have, because dreading that national service might be prolonged a little bit longer, especially for me, it was quite a nasty dread. And these they do make, but I think there is something, because he's on that philosophical quest. He is certainly on a spiritual inquiry, which is really quite profound, and I think he's on the lookout for something as well, which is where that started. I don't think it was the war that started that philosophical quest, which he finds in literature and all his studies and trying to wrestle family life with the intellectual life. There's that tension between what is going on, what is it all about?
Yeah, I think that's really perceptive about his character. I mean, I think one of the things Guy began us with was, Thomas's sense that the beginning of people's lives and the end of people's lives are invisible. And in that sense, I think the likely source of the sense of loss is going to be always invisible to us. It's something sort of intrinsic to his character, his nature, which we'll never fathom.
Going back to that ignored way bit of bitterness in the end use, this first time I've read it, and I was infuriated by this book, because every now and again there was wonderful set pieces, and it was quite fascinating to learn about the hemlock in this bit of ditch and all this stuff. But I got very, very frustrated by it. What was yours, Ralph? Why did I interrupt you?
I was just thinking about the question about the sense of loss and where that comes from. I kind of think we don't necessarily know. I think another
aspect of the ignored way, the whole book, it's quite a thick book. And he says, and it's something which I hadn't quite realized. I thought when he wrote a book about the ignored way, he was following something like Hadrian's Wall. But the whole book is that we don't know what the ignored way is. We don't know where it begins. We don't know where it ends. Does this bit of field become part of it? Or is that something else? And I think this is an old trackway here. Archaeology is fascinating me from an archaeologist's point of view, because I think, I suppose these people don't really know where this road is. And they find these sort of formations, and now with their, what we call these things, drones, finding out what the lay of the land is like. But it's almost a book about a non-issue. But it is there.
Yeah, it's an elusive thing, like a person.
And maybe the earliest. One of the books I said it is the earliest track still in Britain, and whether it goes back to pagan roots as well. So it's, yes, but it's, yes. It is so tenuous.
There was a good talk this afternoon about home in Thomas, that land, my home, I have never seen. You know, there's nostalgia in Thomas is very, very strong. That the quest is for something lost. Something lost. That there's some awareness of something maybe to do with family, maybe to do with, I don't know, who knows, Welshness. And I think in that poem, The Ash Grove, there is the sense of something very far back that he's trying to retrieve, and can just about do that. And there are a number of those moments, trying to get hold of something, or trying to get home and find something lost, but finding finding the self and losing the self are very, again, interwoven in Thomas, and there are these moments of discovery, epiphany,
yes,
found, but then is it lost again?
We were back to desire. You've made me understand desire's self a little bit more there. What is it that makes human beings desire to find out? Because it seems very obvious that's what human beings do. They desire to find out. But where is the seed of that desire of investigation, probing, thinking of too much upon the event?
Frost says that it's eyes seeking the response of eyes. It's the initial separation that gives us that sense of loss. It's the desire to somehow reconnect beyond language, to see in the eyes of the other some adequate sense of self. Some people are just born with a sense of loss, and I think Thomas is one of them. I mean, there are specific losses, but there's also simply the melancholy of separation, of being singular. And I think it runs all through Thomas, that desire to connect.
And Adam and Eve are told that they must not find out the source of good and evil, and yet they mustn't go on that quest. They've just got to enjoy their animal nature and just frolic.
I wonder if that sense of loss might have come with becoming a young father and not having that ability perhaps to develop the course that he thought he was on, and going into one that led to him doing hack work and responsibility. And did he lose that late youth as a result? Is that the sense of loss? Perhaps.
And Thomas felt that, didn't he?
Perhaps for another time.
I think we've worn everyone out, Jeremy. I think.
I was just going to say that we've managed to go through a whole evening again without mentioning Helen. I think, and so this love affair between Thomas and Frost is a very interesting one in the way that Jeremy moved very close to mentioning her by talking about becoming a father. But it is interesting that wives, particularly Helen in this sense, gets pushed out of the conversation when it comes to the great love story of Thomas and Frost.
Well, maybe our plan for next year should be to have a look at the other halves and the partners and their involvement.
Sounds like a great thought.
So maybe we'll steer it in that direction. But yeah, no, it's been fascinating just being sat here doing technical support where I haven't needed to do much and listen to all of this. So from me, a big thank you. But I know Jeremy will want to finish off as well. So I'll be quiet again, Jeremy.
Yeah, thank you very much, Ryan, for being there and holding my hand all that remotely. So maybe I'll be your Thomas to your Frost. But yes, I'd just like to thank everybody this evening for joining in and wonderful discussions. I hope that everybody has taken several things away from tonight. I certainly have. I'm aware of imagery in both poems, but there is just so much. And every time you can read a line one day and it can mean something different to you the next day. And that's in both of their works. And I think that's something that makes their work enduring. So thank you all again for giving your time. I'd just like to put a quick plug in for tomorrow afternoon when we have Andrew Motion and Daljit Nagra in conversation. And Ryan's still selling tickets. And so if you are interested in joining us for that, I think it's going to be a fascinating discussion. We're looking at Edward Thomas and Englishness and his 5/8 Welshness. So if we do see you tomorrow, that would be great. If not, have a wonderful weekend, and we'll see you next year when, apart from looking at the other halves, it's also the 125th anniversary of the publication of The Woodland Life. And so that is going to be the theme, mainly. Of course, The Woodland Life is really a collection of essays. And essays are quite a forgotten skill, I think, these days. So there'll be we'll be looking at the woodland life and the themes around that, but also essays and essay writing. So I think that might be a good point to formally close the evening. And thank you again, everybody who's either here in person or online. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you.